Chappelle. Oh, good lord, that was terrible. Let's try that again. Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to another one of these like joint flips we're going to do together. And we're going to talk about the way that World War I was fought, right? Because we actually got done talking about in class today. G period, this is about to get a little bit confusing. All right, so like, even though y'all are like studs, G period, you're ridiculous. You're so smart. You're doing like so good. It's blowing my mind how much stuff y'all remember. But really, really quick, here's what you're gonna do, okay? So the very first few minutes of this flip is gonna be mostly for G period, maybe a little bit for C period and stuff like that, because I haven't taught you guys yet, which is gonna actually wrap up the like kind of like anxiety following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It's gonna be about 4 minutes. Now, if you're in my D period or if you're in my honors class, what you're gonna do is you're gonna jump ahead about 4 minutes, and you're gonna then actually start your flip right there. And you're gonna be ready to start your flip when you see this exact image of me, big on screeny and stuff like that. But let's go ahead and cut in that stuff that G and C need to do real quick, and here it is. Go on vacation, I gotta get on this boat, right? Like, so like what ends up going down though is a very weird set of events known as the July Crisis, and also known as the metaphorical blank check. A lot of metaphors in this unit, right? Now the big thing about it is, let's start off with a blank check. Before Kaiser Wilhelm leaves, after his cousin, you know, like Kaiser, or like... Can't believe Mr. Bethune just tried to call me like that. What a weirdo. He knows I'm flipping. No, he doesn't. All right, so now look. So the big thing about it, though, is in the long run, is that you have to understand, going forward, that the blank check concept is another metaphor. Because before Kaiser Wilhelm leaves to go on vacation, he actually tells the Austrian leaders, he's like, look, whatever you guys decide to do, I got your back, right? Which is a metaphorical blank check. Now, some of y'all have probably never even seen a check before, which makes me like heartbroken and stuff like that. But checks are a very important form of money transfer, right? Now, if you're handed a check that's filled out but doesn't have the pay to thing filled out, it means that it's blank, right? Now, a blank check means you can write it for as much money as you want. So they didn't actually, Kaiser Wilhelm didn't hand an actual blank check to the Austrians. It's a metaphor, basically saying, hey, no matter what you guys decide to do after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, no matter what you decide to do, whether that's invade Serbia, or whether that's fight Russia, or whether that's anything else, no matter what you decide to do, Germany's got your back. That's why it's called the blank check, because it's like unconditional support, right? So what ends up going down, though, is this thing known as the July Crisis in 1914, because with this new metaphorical blank check, the Austrians go off and they're like, oh, well, we're going to go pick a fight, right? So like they go in July 1914, and we enter into the thing known as the July Crisis, right? The July Crisis was a month-long crisis that was going on, where Austria issued 10 demands to Serbia, knowing full well that the Serbians had no way to complete them. It was like demilitarize, oust the Black Hand, even though it was like a secret organization that nobody knew about. You must get rid of any kind of negative ties to any other groups of people, blah, 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 blah. These crazy intense demands that Serbia knew that they couldn't do, and Austria said, if you don't do them, we're going to invade you, and we're going to take you over, we're going to annex you too, just like we did to Bosnia, right? Well, remember though, Serbians are Slavic, and they're being threatened by an outside power. So what's Russia going to do when they find out that their guy's being threatened? Because it's like, remember, pan-Slavism, all Slavic countries must be united. They mobilize their military, which means they're preparing them for war, right? So Russia begins to mobilize its military, and then what ends up happening in the long run is that alliance system takes effect, and it all breaks down, and it all comes tumbling down like dominoes, one after another. Austria declares war on Serbia after the July Crisis, when everybody's like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And then like what ends up happening, though, is Austria declares war on Serbia, and then the alliances kick in. Russia then declares war on Austria. Germany then declares war on Russia, right? So like, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, Germany like jumps around, turns, and slaps like France in the face for no apparent reason, right? And they start freaking out, and the entire continent descends into war, right? They descend into war aggressively because these alliance systems have taken form. This is like seriously like a fight in a like cafeteria, right? Like say it's like a fight in the cafeteria, and I'll tell you the whole like example of the fight in the cafeteria thing whenever we get back to school and stuff like that next week. But the big thing about it, though, is all these countries are picking sides, except for some, like Belgium. Now, Belgium's going to be an important guy later. Belgium's going to declare themselves neutral. But France gets attacked by Germany, and then Russia attacks, like, Germany, and Germany tries to attack Russia back, and the Austrians try to attack Russia, and all these things go on. But those alliance systems that were super crazy break down, and everybody ends up sending their stuff to war. And that's how World War I starts, when that alliance system goes in, and everyone starts fighting and breaking this entire thing down, right? But we'll talk more about this when we get back. And now what I need y'all to do is you go ahead and jump over to your study guide, start banging that thing out now, just so you can have the ability to get like half of it knocked out on a day like today. But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one. Remember, you have a flip this weekend, but it's going to be very, very short, okay? Remember, you have a flip this weekend, but it's going to be very short. But I'll talk to y'all soon, okay? Y'all have a good one. All right, so welcome back, everybody, right? So now we know that World War I has started, right? Now we know that Germany declared war on Russia and then turned around out of nowhere and declared war on France, like slapped them around and stuff like that. And all these defensive alliances are collapsing in on each other. And a lot of it has to do with this little country of Belgium, right? Now, like the big thing about it, though, getting into it, you need to understand we're now going to attack this entire unit. And we're going to talk about how World War I was fought. We're going to look at a bunch of pictures and stuff like that in this flip. We're going to talk about a lot of like dynamic things that make World War I extremely different than when it actually comes to the other flips, or not the other flips, the other wars that we have talked about up until this point. So let's dive head first in, because I don't want this flip to be eons long, right? So let's go ahead and straight understand that World War I is a new kind of war, right? World War I is a very new kind of war itself. The biggest thing that you need to understand is that, don't worry, it'll be over by Christmas. Wrong! All right, so now look, the biggest thing about it, though, is like getting into it, you have to understand the very beginning of the war, right? So we talked about the very beginning of the war, and it's like Austria declared war on Serbia after the July crisis, right? And then there was that blank check that Germany gave to Austria. And then, of course, when Austria declares war on Serbia, Russia begins to mobilize its military, which is going to take a long time because they're so flinging big, right? So they start mobilizing their military, and out of fear, Germany turns and declares war on France as well. Germany, what are you thinking? Why would you declare war on the two countries that are on either side of you, making it so you have to fight a two-front war? Well, that's just the thing. The Germans thought the best thing to do would be to attack France very, very quickly so they could knock them out as fast as possible, and then they'd be able to focus on Russia, right? Because Russia is the bigger country, the more intimidating one. Because when you look at this entire thing, you got to understand that the big hindrance to the German strategy is the fact that when you're looking at a map of World War I, Germany is going to be attacked on their east side and on their west side if they don't do something quick, right? And that's going to be called a two-front war. Germany wants to avoid said two-front war by attacking France, boom, and trying to knock them out as fast as possible, right? So they come up with this idea called the Schlieffen Plan, right? Now, the Schlieffen Plan is by an ambassador, or not by an ambassador, by a former general of Germany, and his name is Otto von Schlieffen, right? Otto von Schlieffen's idea was let's send 90%, write that number down, 90% of our forces into France and crush them as fast as possible so we can then turn around, focus on Russia over there, right? If we do that, then we want to worry about fighting on two sides. We'll focus on fighting on one, right? Crush France fast by going through Belgium, very important little star note there, and around their forces, and on August 4th on 1914, right? Now, August 4th, 1914 is a very, very important date, right? August 4th, 1914 is going to be the moment that Germany gets stopped, right? So, like, here's the problem. Arthur von Schlieffen said, send 90% of the forces in, but here's the issue. Arthur von Schlieffen's been dead since 1907, right? So, like, he's been dead for quite some time. So the generals that all followed Arthur von Schlieffen were like, maybe we don't need to use 90% of our forces. How about we use, like, 80% of our forces? And then the ones that followed those guys are like, how about 75? And so they didn't send enough. And the other big thing about it, too, is that Belgium knew that they were coming, right? And so Belgium is going to blow up railroads and burn cities and scorch earth to slow the Germans down. And also, here's the other thing that's going to happen that's very, very important. Belgium, write this down, is a neutral country, right? And the only reason that Britain gets involved in this war was not because they were attacking France. They get involved because Britain supported Belgium into independence. And they supported Belgium's neutrality. And Britain said, Germany, if you step a foot in Belgium because they are supposed to be a neutral country, we're coming in full force. And Britain did just that. Look, Germany, learn from your mistake. Don't step foot in Belgium. Why don't you attack on this area? Oh, the reason why they don't attack on this area is because there's fortifications there, right? So they try to sweep through Belgium, and that was a bad idea because Belgium is going to bring Britain into the war, right? So Great Britain now declares war on Germany, and the Germans get stopped, right? The Germans get slowed up, stopped, and at this thing called the very first Battle of the Marne, the two fronts are going to basically be drawn, right? This war is going to result in a two-front war, so Germany is at an automatic disadvantage, right? Germany is at a massive disadvantage because they are fighting on either side of their country. It's very aggressive and very, very intense. You don't want to do that to yourself. It's very, very rough. Now, the Western Front is going to be in northern France, and it's going to go all the way down to the Mediterranean. I'm not kidding you when I tell you this. There are 440 miles of trenches, and we'll talk about trench warfare here in a minute. And I know Caitlin Poirier wrote down trench warfare in her notes because she's that studious, right? Now, the biggest thing about it, though, is getting into it. The Eastern Front, though, was on the other side. The Eastern Front was the Germany-Russia border, and the thing about it is the Schlieffen Plan should have gone against Russia because Russia was not prepared for this war, right? They weren't prepared. They had a huge army, but they didn't have enough guns, right? So now, but getting into it, the Eastern Front is going to start on the Germany-Austria side and eventually get pushed back into Russia, right? So Germany is fighting a war on two sides, and it's dramatic, and it's very, very intense. But here's another little thing that you need to understand about this war. Even though that Germany was going to be fighting a two-front war, even though they got slowed down, even though the Schlieffen Plan didn't work, and even though Britain declares war on Germany right after they step foot in Belgium, you have to understand, that's not how everybody reacted. You would think that people would be like, oh no, this war is going to be terrible. War is a bad thing. It is going to destroy us all. Humanity, why do we do these things to ourselves? But that's not the mood that everybody came into this with. Actually, everybody came into World War I feeling like it's the best thing ever. This was the reaction from people when World War I started. These right here are French. No, those are those German or French soldiers? I think that those are French soldiers. Now, I'll have to look up their uniforms and stuff like that. Heading off to World War I. Look at the excited faces on these young men's faces. Look at this right here. People grabbing at these French soldiers going out to war and being like, oh, we're so proud of you. We're so proud of you. Because nationalism is overflowing, right? Literally, there were people quoted as saying, the streets of Vienna, Berlin, and Paris were filled with cheering crowds at the onset of war because these nationalistic tensions have boiled over and now everyone is excited to go to war. That's never a good thing, right? So, and there was a common thing going on where it said, don't worry, the war will be over by Christmas, right? We're going to decidedly win this war because we are France, or we're going to win this war because we are Germany, or we're going to win this war because we are Russia, right? The thing about it is, though, is that's not what ends up happening because it doesn't end by Christmas. It lasts for 4 years, right? And World War I is going to be a decidedly different kind of war, a scary kind of war, an intense kind of war that's going to lead to the death and destruction of so many of those young men that you just saw in that image, right? So many of those young men who were sons and husbands of so many people and actually like father figures or cousins or uncles or just important family members to so many are going to end up dead during this war. 10 million soldiers die, and that's not even including the 10 million civilians that died, right? When Germany tried to sweep through Belgium, they actually killed Belgium citizens for resisting, right? So the thing about it you have to understand is that World War I is going to be dramatically different from any war that has ever been seen up to this point. Because what did war look like before this, right? War looked like Napoleonic warfare before this, right? Remember when we talked about Napoleon and how, like, his army would march up, you know what I mean? It would just be like, and they would be in the middle of big fields, and one line of army would be right here, another line of army would be right here, and they would just shoot at each other until they charged, and whoever retreated lost said battle, right? That's what war looked like before World War I. War before World War I looked like the pictures that I'm throwing up right now. It was very dramatic. It was very colorful. It was very intense in the sense of, look at their uniforms. They're very, very bright and intense and very, very aggressive. Well, the thing about it is that's not what World War I is going to look like. World War I was dominated by a strategy known as trench warfare, right? Trench warfare, where opposing sides are attacking one another and defending themselves in really deep trenches, right? Now, there's barbed wire and obstacles between those two trenches in an area known as no man's land, right? So really, really quickly, though, we're going to talk about that here in a second, like about the but why and stuff like that. But this right here is not trench warfare. Some of you have probably seen pictures like this. This is actually from World War II. That's not trench warfare. This is trench warfare, right? Where these men are having to emerge out of their trench and storm over that area of no man's land and try to get into the enemy's trench on the other side of the field, right? Now, but why, though? Why would World War I be this disgusting, muddy, nasty, non-modern, gross-looking thing known as trench warfare? Where a lot of it has to do with the recent inventions that have come along. Because what recent invention would make it so this type of warfare was very horrific and kind of necessary because they had never seen this weapon used in war before? For those of you who guessed it, that is exactly right. Very, very good job to Who am I going to call that on? Very, very good job, Ava Timpany. That is exactly right. The Maxim machine gun, right? So, like, very good job, Isabella McCann, who I know makes a great, like, Maxim machine gun noise and stuff like that. Maxim machine guns are now fully automatic weapons that are changing the way wars are fought, right? You have to understand that no one was prepared for the machine gun or for the new weaponry or the new industrial technology that was coming along with it, because it's now going to be applied to war. Because the earliest battles with the Schlieffen Plan, like, because of the Schlieffen Plan, when they were sweeping in to try and knock out France as fast as possible, that ultimately failed. The first Battle of the Marne will actually basically decide that trench warfare will be the dominant force used, right? The very first Battle of the Marne looked a lot like this. The very first battle where French and German soldiers engaged one another was in the middle of an open field. Look right here really quickly. You see these German soldiers that are sitting behind this little, like, this little tiny hill right there, trying to get cover? Well, they're trying to get cover because the French showed up with Maxim machine guns, right? Maxim machine guns where they can just go clap, clap, like, and just like let off that stuff. So all the enemy armies must get down to cover themselves and wait for that machine gun to reload. Well, what's going to end up occurring is at the first Battle of the Marne, the Germans are going to fall back and they're going to start retreating because of these machine guns. And when they get back a certain distance, they take out a new industrial like thing, a shovel, and they start digging to get underneath the machine gun fire so they can get down and then like protect themselves, and then when the machine gun fire stops, they'll be able to pop up and then look over the top. Well, what's going to happen if you have a trench, Germans? The French are going to build some too, right? And this begins this thing known as the race for the sea, right? The Germans were defeated, but at the first Battle of the Marne, they may have lost, but when they retreated, they dug in. Literally, they dug into the ground, creating the very first trenches to avoid that machine gun fire, right? And so this is then going to turn into what's known as the race for the sea, because the first Battle of the Marne happened in northern France, right? And if you got one singular trench that's only about, let's say, 100 feet long, right? Well, the French army is going to try to do what to you? They're going to try to outflank you. They're going to try to come around the sides and stuff like that. And then the French are going to be like, oh no! And they're going to dig their trench a little further. And then the Germans are going to dig theirs a little further. So it started this thing called the race for the sea. And the trenches just kept getting longer and longer and longer and longer and longer and longer until ultimately there were over 440 contiguous miles of trenches. The very first trenches grew into intense networks as the war progressed. And there was literally a trench or a singular system of trenches that went from the English Channel in northern France all the way down to the Mediterranean Sea along the east coast or the eastern border of France, right? So you're talking about 440 miles of trenches. That is insane. That means you could get in that one trench and just kind of keep walking for 440 miles. Now, that's not necessarily, it's not perfect. Like if you get hit by an artillery shell and something explodes and your trench gets messed up, it's not contiguous anymore, but it's a matter of time until they redig it and stuff like that. But trench warfare is ultimately a very, very terrifying type of warfare. And this is like the flanking that I was talking about. So like here are the original trenches, and the Germans were like, we're going to come this way, and then they would dig another trench right here, and the French would be like, we're going to come this way, and then they would dig their trench on that side. And so this war is going to be drastically different from any war that anybody has ever seen up to this point, right? Even the nature of their uniforms is going to change, right? Because due to the fact that the uniforms used to be very brightly colored and used to show the national pride of their people, and French soldiers would run in with like blue tops and red like caps and stuff like that. Well, now you need to not be seen. So they're going to start moving towards camouflage and earth tone colors and stuff like that. This right here too. Also, people were still, at the very beginning of this war, they started out on horses, all right? So like this war started on horses because the cavalry will go out and win this war for us. We'll storm through no man's land on a horse. Yeah, like what's Sprinkles gonna do against a machine gun, huh? Like, yeah, nothing. So like literally write this phrase down. Write this phrase down. It's another important quote. It's up there with all roads lead to Rome. It's up there with the sun never sets on the British Empire, right? This quote is also very important as well. World War I started on horses and it ended in tanks, right? Like, so like, as you can tell, the dramatically wartime technology is going to accelerate to try and increase the like death toll from World War I and all this trench warfare. This is a guy literally jumping over one of the trenches to try and get out into no man's land and storm an area. And look at these trenches. Over time, they get more and more intense and they start sleeping in them a little bit more often and stuff like that. And German trenches were like super nice because they actually dug theirs first, whereas French trenches were like actually very, very kind of crusty looking. And it all happened because of this thing. that Maxim machine gun. That machine gun right there dramatically changed the way the war went, right? Dramatically changed the way the war went. It's going to lead to more death than any war has ever seen before, and it's all going to take place between these countries. Your Eastern Front will be right here, which, little side note, put a star next to this one. The Eastern Front that is on this side that gets pushed back really hard, not as many trenches, right? The trench warfare mostly dominated the Western Front side, right? The Western Front cut through France and Germany, and the Eastern Front was between Germany, Russia, and Austria, right? So the thing you need to understand is that the Eastern Front didn't have nearly as much trenches because there was a lot of wide open land, and also because it was super cold there during the winter, so permafrost made it really, really difficult to dig said trenches in, right? So now the thing about it is then going forward that you need to understand is that the Eastern Front was not home to the amount of intense trench warfare that the West was. It's just way too expensive, and at times it was way too cold. So the Russians didn't dig trenches much like the French did. It was much more open battle and much more intense. And on top of all of this, here come the Ottomans, right? So the Ottoman Empire joins the Central Powers in October of 1914, a couple of months into the war, bringing also a southern kind of front in as well that includes the Middle East. Now, the thing about it, though, going into it, most of the war was focused right here in Europe, right? You can see your Western Front right there, and then you can see the Eastern Front right here on this side. Now, going into it, though, this is a worldwide war the second the Ottomans get involved, because now we've got fighting going on in Asia, right? And then we get fighting going on in Africa between the imperial colonies that the Europeans had already taken over. And then we get fighting going on in South America from some of the other imperial colonies as well. And this war just expands and grotesquely grows, but the bulk of the fighting was in Europe. And trench warfare is also just such a drastically disgusting strategy for war that it ends up resulting in this. A stalemate, right? Stalemates are a very, very important concept that you need to understand when you're actually dynamically trying to understand the way that World War I was fought. Due to the fact that you're digging these trenches in these different areas and you have this dramatically big, gigantic system, you don't move the other side very much. What a stalemate is it's a deadlock in which neither side is able to defeat the other one, right? So basically you've got Germany on this side, France and Britain on this side, and they're fighting each other on the Western Front, but no one's winning. No one's gaining any ground. You're just throwing people at each other and death and suffering at one another until the other side gives up, right? But the thing about it is, that is the nature of trench warfare. It will result in a stalemate because of what the trenches look like. This is literally a diagram of a trench. It's like if we sliced a trench in half and looked down it, right? The trenches literally were about 6 feet in depth. They would sometimes have a board that you could get up and stand up on, and a sandbag wall, and you would fire over the top of it, right? Now, there's a very key important thing that you're noticing in a lot of this. Barbed wire. And we'll talk about barbed wire a little bit later. We're going to talk about barbed wire a lot. Barbed wire is super important. Something you should probably jot down. Barbed wire. Say barbed wire, barbed wire. Barbed wire, barbed wire, barbed wire. Barbed wire, barbed wire, barbed wire. Right? So barbed wire. Now, the biggest thing about it, though, is in the long run, is this is what your trench networks looked like as well. Here was your front line trench, and we'll talk also why it has corners on it and stuff like that here in a second. And no man's land was out here, and you usually had barbed wire that actually went in front of your front line trench, and then you had networks of communications and supply trenches that actually went behind your own trench, right? And so then you had these things right here. Artillery guns. Now, those things are very, very important, and we'll talk about these bad boys right here, these long-range artillery weapons, but this is what World War I looked like. Look at the networks of trenches, and the enemy would be on the other side, over here in this general area, and the only real way to attack the other side was to go over the top, right? So here is one side's frontline trench, and here is the other side. This would be a German frontline trench, and then this would be their frontline trench, and all these other trenches connect supplies and communications and bring other people up to the front as well. So essentially what trench warfare is two lines fighting against each other, all trying to protect themselves from machine guns. And this right there is an actual picture of trench warfare in action. This is a picture from World War I taken by an observation balloon. So you can literally see no man's land right here. And no man's land was covered with downed planes and dead bodies and explosives and all these other crazy things. And here are the trench networks that are set up behind them, right? And it's also really important to understand one other key thing is why are the trenches in these little zigzags, right? So it's a very big thing I'm probably going to ask you on the test and stuff is why isn't it just a straight line? Why would they make it complicated and put in all these zigzags? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that if you don't have zigzags like this, if somebody were to take and throw it into the actual, like a grenade, and huck it into your trench, you need a way to get cover, right? You need a way to get cover. So you would literally, like, let's say hypothetically you got, like, I don't know, Gabby LeBlanc standing right here, and then, like, Ava Kirsch is the enemy and throws a grenade into her trench. All she's got to do is go around the side right there, grenade will explode, and then she can come around back out the other side and keep shooting, right? So that's why they weren't dug in, like, straight lines, right? So the other big thing that you need to understand, though, is, like, just the absolute just desecration that was no man's land. Why would barbed wire be such a big deal when it comes to actually creating fortifications and ways to keep yourself safe during all of this stuff? Well, a lot of it has to do with how you attack in trench warfare, right? You have to understand that territory in this is gained and lost at, like, yards at a time, right? So, like, this is at times also making the human cost catastrophic, right? Bombardments were the biggest way to attack the enemy front lines. What a bombardment is when you use artillery guns that claim the most lives in World War I. This right here, that is an artillery gun. That are the things, the artillery guns that were sitting in the back areas of the trenches that would lob explosive devices all the way over no man's land and hit the enemy trench side, making a massive explosion that would actually kill anybody who was within like 50 feet of that explosion, right? So artillery guns claimed the largest amount of life out of any other weapon in the World War I, and that was the biggest way that they tried to destroy each other. They also tried to use those artillery guns to break up and destroy the barbed wire that was out in no man's land. Because think about it, the only true way to attack the other opposite trench, if you're a regular infantry soldier, is by doing what's known as going over the top, right? And over the top is literally leaving your trench, storming over no man's land, and getting down into the enemy trench and shooting as many people as you can. Well, the thing about it is there's so much barbed wire out there to stop you, right? And what would happen is you would get caught up in the barbed wire and oftentimes shot by the enemy before you ever even made it over there, right? So as you can see, this war is horrific, and it's leading to these massive stalemates and a massive cost of human life. But what we're going to do is we're going to pick right up right there and talk more about World War I when I see y'all again in class. Y'all have a good one, all right?